Hello, and welcome to I Hate Talking, a podcast about talking, including etymology, frustrating topics, current events, and other random subjects. I'm Adam.
And I'm Steph. We are married, and we invite you into these discussions with us as we talk about the good and the bad of talking.
We hope you enjoy today's episode. This is episode 8.
Hi.
So right before we started recording, you asked a question.
I said, what are we talking about tonight?
It's a very good question. So would you care to answer?
I don't know what we're talking about.
Well, we always start with a word or phrase of the episode. So that is one of the things that we're going to be talking about in this episode. And today's word or phrase of the episode is elastic. Elastic.
Oh, no. Okay.
So when you hear the word elastic, do you think of the noun first?
Well, the reason I laughed was because I was thinking of my elastic pants.
So in that case, pants is the noun and elastic is the adjective that describes the pants. So I guess technically you are thinking of the adjective that describes the pants, but the pants are only elastic because of a certain attribute that they have.
I love that attribute. It's very helpful right now.
Exactly. So that attribute is actually because it contains elastic, which would be the noun, a cord, tape, or fabric woven with strips of rubber, which returns to its original length or shape after being stretched, as in elastic pants.
Great. So which version were you thinking of?
I think I would actually think of the adjective first. So I would actually think of it describing a material.
That's what I did.
Yes, that is very true. It is, you are describing the material that returns to its original shape when it's stretched. There's a nuance there, though, in fact, because there's a physical object that is actually the elastic band within the pants that makes it be described as elastic pants.
Right.
So we are actually going to be talking in a moment about how elasticity is actually potentially applicable to people.
Clever. I see that.
That is it. So that is the word or phrase of the episode. We have the noun as well as the adjective, elastic, able to resume its normal shape spontaneously after contraction, dilation, or distortion.
So before we get into the discussion about elasticity, ooh, that's a hard word. Elasticity. Elasticity. This is a tangent, but all I can think of right now after we started this conversation, our kids started martial arts, and when they're preschool, like toddlers, their belts are not your typical belt. It's made out of Velcro, so that way the parents don't have to untie and retie the belt properly every time. And so when the instructor informed the whole class that my son was getting this, he very proudly announced, Velcro is my favorite material. Like, very straightforward, very matter of fact. And I know we're talking about elastic. That's all I can think of is like, elastic is my favorite material for pants.
And there you have it. So one of the topics that we started talking about in some previous episodes was verbal processing versus non-verbal processing. And one of the questions that we asked ourselves and didn't or actually arrive at a answer because we moved on to other subjects was if there was even a particular word related to a non-verbal processor that described that attribute other than just it being the antithesis of the verbal processor. So I've actually done a little bit of research on that and have not found a particular word that aptly describes a non-verbal processor. Verbal processor is something that is, I think, well documented and well established within some of the current research. But it is typically referred to as a nonverbal processor for the opposite end of the spectrum. There's a few websites or research out there that describes it as internal versus external processing. So whereas the verbal processor is going to be the external processor and the nonverbal processor is going to be the internal processor. And then even saw one website that described it as the talker versus the thinker.
I don't like that.
And I agree. I think that is a overgeneralization because certainly talkers will think and must think, and thinkers will often talk unless they hate talking.
I like that you looked it up and that you even said the word that came to my mind, which would be internal processing. I feel like that's a positive spin, a different way to word nonverbal.
Yep, that was cited as that particular phrase on a number of places that I looked at. The external processor, which is typically going to be associated with the verbal processor, and then the internal processor, which is going to be typically associated with the nonverbal processor. But I do think that it is a more apt description of what we're talking about in terms of the external processor is going to use words or even writing or maybe some of those aspects of narrative that we talked about in terms of painting or sculpture or other outputs of art in order to express themselves, and not only express themselves, but come to an understanding in terms of what they are experiencing.
And I hesitate even saying this because we've discussed your hate for narrative or your dislike for narrative. But when I have to think about something and work something out in my brain, whether it's a math problem or a relationship problem, I have to talk it out loud, whether it's to somebody else or even to myself. Just saying the words out loud helps me come to a conclusion. And you're the opposite, where if you and I are discussing something and you bring it up, your mind is mostly made up. I mean, you are open to reason and you're open to my opinions. But generally, by the time you speak something, you've thought it through for long enough that this is your conclusion.
Exactly. So in terms of how I maybe am processing the experience that I'm having, or even in a conversation that I'm having, I'm definitely going to be thinking about how I respond to that, or I'm going to internalize even what conclusions and beliefs that I have before I speak.
Yeah, that's something that we personally have had to work on over the years. Is in the beginning of our marriage, we didn't understand that when I bring something up, it's the initial maybe seeds that I'm thinking of and need to talk it out. Where when you bring something up, it's pretty much you've decided something. And so it was different because if you brought something up, I'd want to start spitballing ideas and you'd be like, no, this is what I think is right. And then maybe get frustrated that I don't see, maybe that I'm pushing back on your ideas. And on the other side, I'd get frustrated because you maybe wouldn't give me anything when I'd start spitballing. Or you'd come to, okay, well, we're going to do this. I'm like, well, no, wait, let's discuss this. Let's go back and forth, that give and take, and come to a conclusion.
And I do think that is something that we have developed in our relationship over the years, that we have, when it comes to a big decision, maybe that quiet time in between where we talk about it initially and then have that separation so that I do have time to think and then come back and discuss it more.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we are trying to get to a conclusion from that quote unquote spitballing session, that I may be feeling hurried to come to a conclusion because I perceive that as needing to come to a final conclusion during that discussion rather than being able to entertain it as a variety of options that we are discussing.
Yeah. I mean, this is not a marriage podcast. We're not trying to give advice to change people's lives, but that is something that's been super helpful for us, is saying if there's something that's a disagreement or something that's even just an idea, me throwing the thought out there and then giving you time, like we'll discuss this tonight at 7 or something like that, gives you the time to think about it, and then gives us the time to come back and discuss it later.
And it is true, this is not specifically a marriage podcast. However, it is a podcast where we encourage people to begin that journey to understanding through talking.
Oh, talking to your spouse, talking to your friends.
Exactly. So when it comes to verbal processing and nonverbal processing, I think this is yet another particular thing that we need to be aware of when we do partake in conversation. Not only if the person is an introvert or extrovert or highly sensitive or not, or enjoys a loud environment or a quiet environment, but also how they even are able to process what they are thinking themselves, either through verbal processing or, as we said, the external processing, or the more nonverbal processing, or, as we said, internal processing.
Yeah, and something that the past couple years I've learned from somebody and tried to implement it better is especially when I meet new people or have very beginning stages of a friendship, I used to ask a lot of questions, and if I didn't get an answer right away, I would take it almost personally, like, oh, they must not want to talk to me, like I'm being nosy. They don't want to share their private information with me. And I'd kind of just shut down and assume that friendship was no good. But learning that, like, giving them the time to answer, or even pushing a little bit more sometimes, depending on it, being like, oh, well, tell me more about that. And because I'll just instantly start talking. And maybe some people need a little bit more of an encouragement. Like, I want to hear what you're saying, so tell me more about that. Or knowing that maybe we can circle back to this topic later if they need to think about it more, versus it being like, oh, they don't like me personally.
Exactly. And that goes even back to some of the very earlier episodes that, if we hate talking to people or enjoy talking to people, is it because of our own intrinsic motivation or because of motivation to hear and understand the person on the other side of the conversation?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I don't want to veer off too far, but they were saying, I remember this conversation with somebody I had a couple years ago. It was a group of women, and the majority of them all agreed that after we leave this event, they'd always, on the ride home, think about everything they said and nitpick it and just feel so much shame. And it's not, we weren't saying bad things. It was a good group. But it was interesting to me because I spoke up at that moment and said, I don't think those things about you guys. When I'm driving home, I'm thinking, oh, that was a great conversation. That was so much fun. Where they're thinking about every nuance that might have been said.
A very astute observation. And I think that does relate back to perhaps the internal processor versus external processor. Though it is interesting to note that there may be another thing to explore here, because it seems that since they were talking this out loud, that there is still some aspect of verbal processing going on here, even though the perspectives on the actual events that transpired are so different.
Are you saying because they spoke those things initially to begin with, or that they were sharing with me that they afterwards feel uncomfortable?
So it depends. I guess we would need to know whether they were thinking these things in their mind either at the time of the event itself or were reflecting on it and then decided to share it, or if they were sharing these things in the verbal processing way of just talking them out in order to come to their own particular understanding. So was the point of them sharing to actually share information with those that they were talking to, or was the point of talking to be able to verbally process what they themselves needed to understand?
Are you asking me?
Well, I wasn't there, so I guess I am.
I felt like it when I took it as they were saying it, and even reflecting back, it was more of like a shame. Like, man, I'm going to go home and analyze every moment of this conversation.
Well, there you go. It sounds like, based on that comment, that this was their initial sharing of this in order to process it, and that because you said that they are going to further reflect on it, that they are verbal processors.
Huh. Okay. Even though they're not talking later on about it. If they do the initial talk with somebody and then the rest of the talk is with themselves. Okay, how does your brain work?
So my brain would, in this scenario, never, ever share a shameful event unless I am particularly prompted to, or it's in a very safe space with a trusted person. I, as a nonverbal processor, if I have a embarrassing moment or a shameful thing that happened to me based on either the society or culture or people around me that did not approve of a particular action, even though it may not have been wrong, that I'm going to internalize that. I can think of specific times from decades ago, just right now, that I still remember to this day and am sometimes reminded in my mind that this happened. Don't ever do this again. And I've never shared those things with people because I am not a verbal processor.
Okay, but I will be asking you about them when we turn this off.
And perhaps maybe we'll even get some fan mail that we'll ask about it as well.
Yeah. Fan mail. Ask Adam his deep, dark secrets.
So I think what we have concluded then is that this scenario that you are describing was actually people verbally processing their experience in order to come to an understanding on what happened.
I mean, you're persuading me. I'm understanding. I came to a different conclusion initially. I'm open to changing that to your side. Is there any middle ground then? Because it can't just all be black and white, right? Like, is there a middle ground between verbal processor and internal processing? Because, okay, to give you an example, I can't not, I mean, I can. Successfully, I literally say the words out loud before I make a decision. If they're like stuck in my head, I have a hard time even just having this conversation with myself back and forth. But if I'm speaking words to myself, I look maybe unhinged at the grocery store talking to myself. Like, which cereal should I buy? Oh, this one's a little cheaper. Okay, this is better deal. I'll get this one. That's how I would go. So that's definitely what I think of as external processor. And your internal, where everything is within yourself. What about when you do both? Talk it out loud and then think about it yourself.
So I think perhaps this is an experiment that you or any of our verbal processors or external processors, or as we said, talkers, can try, is do not have that initial conversation and see if you can get to that internal step first. Because that is the difference. Because as a nonverbal processor or a internal processor, or as we have said, a thinker, in my experience, think about those things before we feel ready to discuss it with anyone, or perhaps we will hate talking about it and never share it.
I love that. Can you give me an example in your head then? How do you go about making a decision? It could be any decision.
So I just came to a decision on what I'm going to say. But before I started talking, I have a particular list of things that I want to address that I'm going to talk about. And I am not really thinking as I'm speaking, but I'm actually pre-thinking all the words that are coming out of my mouth right now.
So it's like when you type it and it's a delayed text on the screen.
Yes. So I think one of the things that I have taken to doing when I give the perception to others that I'm thinking on my feet is that I'm actually, to some degree, parallel processing within my mind, within my brain, that I'm thinking in one stream of my thought process and I am delaying what my mouth is saying because I am giving those commands to my mouth and tongue after I've already thought the words that I'm going to say.
Okay, so a later discussion, we need to have another episode, would be how you can possibly do that and listen to other people. Would be interesting to talk about talking and listening, how they coexist. But I love what you just said, and I can just picture this visual in my head of you're typing on a computer. If your brain's the screen, you're typing, and then the words appear. And then mine's the opposite, right? Where I'm typing, and then I'm reading the words on the screen as they're coming out. They're already there, and I'm reading. Where you would already have the words written.
So I think that the verbal processor is somebody that is going to
Be amazing
and think perhaps more about what they're saying after they say it because they need to say it in order to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas somebody that is an internal processor and a nonverbal processor are going to think before they speak because that is the only way that they feel comfortable speaking.
And you and I probably are pretty extreme on both ends of this spectrum. But again, is there others in the middle that do both?
So I think the human experience and the human psyche is multifaceted with many, many, many different things that need to be considered. And the way that you process your own internal monologue is going to be one of those aspects, but also introvert versus extrovert, the sensitivity level that one has, even the gender that one has, even different nurture versus nature aspects of your upbringing are going to impact that and give a very different, unique experience to everyone, but that in some form or fashion that you will fall in either one or the other for this particular attribute. But we know that not only pants can be elastic, but that people can be elastic, and that when you have this journey to understanding, not only will you understand people that you're talking to better, but also potentially understand yourself better. And when you are elastic, you will be able to be better within these situations that either call on those things to be either more verbally processed or internally processed. And I think that's maybe also what you're getting at, is that while your default state may be one or the other, that there is some degree of elasticity where you can either have the additional capacity to act like the other one for a time being. It may take more energy. It may be uncomfortable. It may even also be to some degree faking it, but that you will be able to act in this other representation of the spectrum from your natural state. So I think we've been able to learn a lot, and hopefully you have seen that we are already on the journey to understanding, and hopefully some of these things that we've discussed are insightful to not only those people that you talk to, but also to yourself. So, from your friends at I Hate Talking, until next time, remember, it is only through talking that we begin the journey to understanding.